Honourable Tom McLean.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and that bit of information that you gave us there, that people outside of the House can't hear this information as well as they need to, will actually help the Labor Party, because that last speech from Mr Twyford was atrocious, Mr Speaker. He spent his whole time saying that they're not interested in race. That was the first 5 minutes of his speech. The other 5 minutes of his speech was purely about Chinese people. And you can't, on the one hand, Mr Speaker, say we're not interested in race-based policies if you're in the Labor Party when it comes to this issue, when Mr Twyford is the man that has released a list of names that are just Chinese-sounding, and then in the other half of his speech talk only about Chinese people and Chinese investors. Mr Speaker, I would say to you that this is a very important piece of legislation, and it is good legislation, and it's well thought out legislation. Before it was brought to the House, it went through full public consultation. But more important than that, when it comes to tax policy in this country, Mr Speaker, we have a very long process and precedent in place where we engage with the tax advisory community before we bring legislation forward so that we can seek their views, and they give us input, and they do so freely and willingly. And these are tax experts in New Zealand who come from all parts of the world. We're interested in good tax policy, and we're interested in the assistance they give us. We're not interested in where they've come from, unlike Mr Twyford and everything he says when it comes to housing in Auckland and New Zealand. So this legislation was brought to the House, Mr Speaker, well thought out. It does a number of things. We have an expectation on this side of the House that where tax is owed, people should pay it. But we also want to make sure that it's easy to pay tax and that Inland Revenue can use the resources, the scarce resources on behalf of the taxpayer we give them, to target those who choose not to pay tax. We don't want to burden everyday New Zealanders that meet their obligation. So this legislation is one of 3 measures announced around budget by our Prime Minister. The first is a collection of Inland Revenue numbers when a property transaction takes place. I'll come to that in a moment. The second is the Bright Line test that has gone through the House this week, that will clarify a tax obligation. These 2 pieces of legislation go hand in hand, Mr Speaker. If you take only one of them, actually, you're only seeing half of the picture. It's very important, the 2 together. The third is a withholding regime upon overseas people when they sell a property and they've made a gain. So there's more legislation will come to the House. I'm out consulting on that at the moment, where some of that gain will be withheld in lieu of their tax obligation. So in this legislation, Mr Speaker, everybody but those who have a principal residence in New Zealand must provide their IRD number when they purchase a property. That's the first thing. The second thing is if they're an overseas person, they must get an IRD number before a transaction can go through. They must have a New Zealand bank account as of the 1st of October of this year before they can get that IRD number. And that New Zealand bank account, for it to be given to them, they have to go through the suite of anti-money laundering legislation that is in place in New Zealand that the banks have an obligation to enforce. That overseas person must also give their equivalent of their tax number from the tax jurisdiction they're based in. So whether it's Australia or London or Fiji, or for the purpose of Mr Twyford, if they're in Beijing in China, they must provide us with that information. And the reason for that, Mr Speaker, is actually, as anybody that has a tax obligation in New Zealand, we expect them to pay their fair share of tax. We also have arrangements in place with a number of countries of the world where they should be paying their tax there too. And this information that we collect will be able to be shared with that overseas tax jurisdiction to make sure they're paying their fair share of tax. Now, the one exception to that, Mr Speaker, and I know earlier in the debate and other stages, this was an issue, at least for the opposition, of some contention. And that's that there are a group of New Zealanders that won't have to provide their IRD number. And that is people who are buying a principal residence, their own home, their own residence where they live themselves, or in many cases with their family. Well, the Bright Line test imposes no tax obligation upon those New Zealanders. So I would challenge members of the opposition, Mr Speaker, that actually we would be burdening them for no reason to provide an IRD number when there is no tax obligation or consequence of that purchase and sale of that property. Under the Bright Line test, if you purchase a principal residence and you sell it within 2 years, irrespective of a gain, there is no tax consequence. So why is it that we're then, the opposition is saying we should go out and collect information from these New Zealanders when they won't face a tax obligation? Well, we should collect information on them upon taxi rides, even though they don't pay any tax personally upon that. Why would we do it? It doesn't make sense. But what we have done for that very small group of people who may look to avoid their tax obligation is given tens of millions of dollars to Inland Revenue to enforce compliance around property tax. They've been very good at that. In fact, as we go back, the last government towards the end of the Labor government started this by giving them some money. They back then must have had some concerns, not about Mr. Twyford's concerns, Chinese people buying and selling property in New Zealand, but people meeting a tax obligation they have. They started it back then. Mr. Speaker, we are continuing this so that Inland Revenue can focus on those who are not meeting their obligation, target them, leave all the other law-abiding citizens of New Zealand who have no tax obligation when they purchase a principal residence, leave them alone. Now, to other members of the House who say we should actually just collect that information, well, some would argue that, but I don't, because I actually trust New Zealanders to meet their obligation to the tax department, but where they don't, we're giving IRD resources to focus on that. The final thing I would say to you, Mr. Speaker, is that I agree with Mr. Twyford, at least in the degree I could sense he might have been genuine. This isn't about race. It's not actually about where people come from. This is good tax policy. It's about people paying the tax that is due in New Zealand under the tax rules that are set in New Zealand. We do that so that the government can afford to provide the many services New Zealanders demand and they deserve. And I would say to Mr. Twyford, it's not good enough just to say it isn't about race and then only talk about one race all of the time. Others outside of here, if the sound has come back on, will judge him for that. This is good tax policy and I'm proud to recommend it to the House.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. No. A party vote's called for. I ask the clerk to conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
31 in favour.
Green Party.
14 in favour.
New Zealand First.
12 opposed.
Māori Party.
2 in favour.
Act New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 108, the noes are 12. The motion is agreed to.
Land Transfer Amendment Bill, third reading. Tax Administration Amendment Bill, third reading.
Call on Government Order of the Day number 3.
Passport